That's my cue. Welcome, friends. I would introduce myself, but I think I know just about all of you pretty well. So I'm really glad that you're here tonight for this important conversation, Visions of Vocation. It's going to be wonderful. There are some books over there. Hopefully we'll have some more books tomorrow. I ordered a case from the printer, but they've not yet arrived yet, so we're hoping that they'll be here, and if not, they'll be available in the coming week. So, but I did want to point out that the subtitle of this book by our speaker this weekend is Common Grace for the Common Good. And that might sound just a bit familiar to you because that covers two of our four values that we have as a church: common prayer, common life, common grace, and common good. So the last two. And as we thought about those values, the reason that common grace was so important to me personally is that I grew up in a world, a tradition that was very dualistic, very steeped in dualism. They viewed the world as inherently bad, in contrast to the spiritual that was inherently good. And they were divorced from one another, bifurcated. And so as I came of age, I found it very difficult to understand what role faith played in my normal life. I understood what it meant to study and read my Bible and pray and do churchy things, but I had a very difficult time understanding how that integrated into my life. And so I thankfully discovered this gift of the Reformation, this notion of common grace, this notion that the entire world is a gift and it is steeped with the grace of God, the glory of God. And it is this idea of common grace that has much to say, I believe, for our lives and our vocation and our work. It's the attempt to connect those things that have been torn asunder, to reconnect those things that have been torn asunder. And I would say that if the church has begun the process in the last few decades to reclaim that Reformation gift of common grace, it is because of the work of a few voices, one of whom is our speaker this weekend. So I'm very excited to introduce not the Reverend Doctor, the doctor. It's not the Reverend Doctor, is it? Just the doctor. Okay, great. Nothing wrong with that. Dr. Stephen Garber. Steve, as many of you know and are familiar with his work, but he's the Senior Fellow for Vocation and the Common Good for the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust. He's the author of several books, one of which is right here, another which is out in our bookstore called The Fabric of Faithfulness. He speaks and travels and writes extensively on these very topics. He lives in the D.C. area with his family. He worships at Restoration Anglican Church, and you're familiar with that church in Arlington, Virginia. Would you please give a special warm welcome to Dr. Stephen Garber.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and it's good to see all of you. You are the committed ones, I can see that here on Friday night. Of all those who make their way in and out of Charleston day by day, and then here you are tonight, so God bless you for making your way to the big room here in the evening. Thank you for being drawn in as I was my wife and I flew down from D.C. this morning and watching the Carolina coast. I suppose it was part of North Carolina and then into South Carolina along the way. I couldn't tell which was which. They were all out there. And the sun was glistening the morning lights, and I thought, well, here we come. It's the lowlands of South Carolina. So thank you for being part of your life for a few hours. What's Visions of Vocation for the weekend? And tonight, tomorrow morning, and I'm going to preach on Sunday morning as well. There was a time, of course, in the 20th century when the cotton of Carolina became the cotton of California. And that really is the story of my own life in many ways. In the early 20th century, cotton, of course, had been for some decades, generations, a big part of Carolina life, North and South Carolina. In the 19-teens, when America joined World War I, the airplanes, as they were at the time, the wings were covered with cotton fiber, of all things. And the great question came to those who were thinking about the future of a war was what would happen if the boll weevil actually plagued the South and no cotton was grown for the next year or two. They asked an agronomist from South Carolina, he ended up living in Canada, to go to California to see, in fact, if California could grow cotton. And He made his way across America, and entrepreneurial, thoughtful, smart, gifted, industrious kind of guy that he was, figured out that as an agronomist, it was a wonderful place to go. A lot of sunshine, good soil with water available. And he made the decision to leave the employ of the federal government at the time and just buy hundreds and then thousands of acres of California land. And over the 20th century, California became the leader in the world of producing cotton. Most of the 20th century, the major cash crop of California was cotton. It surprised a lot of Californians and a lot of people all across America. There's a valley there called the San Joaquin Valley, which is about a few hundred miles long, 75 miles wide or so. Sierra Nevada's on the east side of it, the Coast Range on the west side of it, and it's a remarkably fertile place to grow things. Probably half of the nation's fruits and fibers, vegetables are grown actually in California, most of them in the San Joaquin Valley. WB Camp, figured out we grew a lot of cotton there. We moved from Davis, California to Shafter, California, when I was in first grade. My father got his PhD at UC Davis in cotton disease, studying one disease in particular called verticillium wilt. It was interested in the question of how does this plague, verticillium wilt, affect seedlings, cotton seedlings. So planting the seed in the ground, hoping the water's there, maybe it might rain, irrigation, of course. The question of the next 2 or 3 weeks would be, what kind of stand is the language they used to judge the growth, in fact, the consistency, the constancy of cotton all throughout the field. But if verticillium wilt was a problem, it began to plague these little seeds, then of course the seeds that grew was out. My father gave his life to that one question, the verticillium wilt, cotton disease in California. We moved to Shafter when I was in first grade. It was the University of California Research Center there. Brought him to be my WB Capital in the earlier generation. I went to school with his grandchildren. I thought, because I was a pretty big biography reader as a boy, I would become like my father. I read a lot of stories of this guy and this guy. I spent several years of my life reading story after story of these people who grew up as sons of and became, of course, the son of the father who did this kind of world. I assumed that would be true for me until high school came. I didn't like biology, which is a problem. Probably the first vocational crisis of my life. I found, to my surprise, by 15 years later, I was doing my own PhD work, I became interested in the question. It was not verticillium wilt, it had to do with cotton disease. It had to do in some ways with your soul and my soul. And the question was, how do you sustain commitments over time? It's one thing to start off well, like my father's wrote, to plant a seed in good ground, soil, sunshine and leaves, water and leaves, and what will happen the next days and weeks and months is a big question. Will it grow into a mature plant 6-7 months later? That was not my interest. My interest was in watching 20-somethings who seemed to start off well, but then 10 years later had not turned out very well. The things that had once mattered so much to them didn't matter much at all to them. And what happened to you? You seem to be so clear about what was most of all important to you. 1, 2, 5, 10 years later, and not so much anymore. I got interested enough in that question to give, in many ways, my life to that question. So, my father's work was one kind of work and one kind of ground or soil. Mine was more the soil of your soul and mine. How do we keep going, deepening the vision of vocation for a lifetime, clarifying our commitments over the years of our lives, our loves and longings becoming more and more central to who we are and to why we are, therefore to what we do with the days and years of our lives. So yes, the soil conditions our very souls. There's a thesis at the very heart of this Visions of Vocation question, which has become a book over time. And the question is, Can you know the world and still love the world? Can you know the world and still love the world? Thinking about coming to South Carolina the last few weeks, I was thinking, so if I believe the Apostle Paul was right in asking the question, what have your own poets said as you walk through the marketplace of Athens and that? So what are the poets from South Carolina anyway? The stories that they told. And of course, one of the best known stories in all of America is this one. It's called The Big Chill. My wife and I watched it again this week, just after many, many years of not thinking about it very much, thinking it was somewhere down here, wasn't it? And of course, filmed in Beaufort, the late 1980s. What's the story of? Sometimes it's a story which is the context of my own great question in my life. University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, undergraduates together, all had come through 4 years, gone off to various things in the world. Here they are pictured, you know who some of them are, some of them have been in life. And one of them dies in a tragic way. They all get together for the funeral, spend the weekend together. If you know the story is about, so what has happened in the last 20 years of life? And how have you grown up, actually? What's happened with that over these years of your life? This one, this story here, this story there, and you know, the back and forth over the weekend together, the meals, the walks, the going to bed together, it's all over the content of the question of, so who have you become in your life 20 years later? How have these 20 years been for you? And pushing and shoving with each other, dear friends as they are, best friends as they once were together. You know, but what about you, and what happened to you, and you used to believe in this, didn't you, and what happened to you now, and why don't you believe this anymore at all in your life? And it goes on and on like that. I found to my dismay yesterday that even though I've been since early 1980s, a Macintosh user, Apple computer user, and I have made countless keynote presentations in my life. I was trying to put this together yesterday, and I was trying to download a song to put right in the middle of this slide. And I tried this. I went on to discussion forums with Apple, this and that, and try this, try that. And finally, I thought, well, I'm just going to call the Apple support people and say, well, what happened here? And I said, well, try this. And for 20 minutes at least, one guy said, well, try this, try this, try this. I shared my computer screen with him, and he said, well, do this then. And I would try that. Finally, he just hung up. Really? You're going to do that? Just going to walk away from the question? He couldn't figure it out. I thought, oh, okay, I'm not wasting my time with this. About an hour later, I thought, I'm just going to report this to the Apple people. I called again. The guy got the phone. He said, well, the problem is that under new copyright laws, you no longer have access to the songs. I said, but I paid for them all. And they're on my computer and my iPhone, and they're right here, and I can't just download it like I've done for years and years and put it in the middle of this. No. So I said, I hate that. So I was going to play for you every day, and whatever else you're listening to right now, to say, well, here is the big chill. Here's the best music that was put together in the film for a long time. But I couldn't do this. But Aretha Franklin, The Temptations, Three Dog Night, Beach Boys, Rolling Stones, and more.
Steve, you want to leave a little trivia back?
Huh? I do want to hear that.
The piano in our church is the piano from the house
Is it?
in this movie.
Oh my!
I think our piano was in the movie.
Oh my! I saw the piano. Yeah. Ah, wow. I am
There's
impressed.
the presence of
I am impressed. But again, we could linger over this. I won't do much more with it tonight. But this question of, so how do you make it through the years between 20 and 40? What happens in your life? And who do you become in your life? Because by the time we get to be about 40, most of us have settled into who we're going to be for the rest of life. It could be a dramatic, repentant transformation, conversion, which changes everything for somebody, and that does happen in this world. But for most of us, it's more slow. Slowly by slowly, as the Africans say. And habits are formed month after month, year after year, and over through our 20s and our 30s, we kind of move away from just having a bike to buying a car, and just renting an apartment to buying a house, going to a laundromat, getting a washing machine and a dryer. And we need to be 40 or so, we sort of decided, okay, it's not going to be in my life now. I I am who I'm going to be. I'll grow into that more fully, perhaps, I suppose. But I'm not really going to change very much probably now, because I'm who I'm going to be now. Those choices have already been made. The sociologists sometimes call those 20 to 40 years the valley of the diapers. You're sort of settling in. You're just figuratively, perhaps, literally, perhaps, changing a lot of diapers for a while. And then that no longer is the way that it is. Well, the big chill in its own kind of way, of course, is that story. What happened? And who are you? What happened to the life that you thought you were going to have when you were a 20-year-old University of Michigan undergraduate? And here you're doing this now? I can't believe it. You used to be so much more this kind of a person. And that's the story of this film, of course. Well, I want to speak tonight with you about this question of to know and to love, which I've argued would be the heart of vocation for everyone, everywhere. To know and to love. To know and to love. So let's pray. So God in heaven, give us wisdom tonight. Thank you for each one who's come here to be with us for a little bit, to think together, to think out loud together, to push and shove each other, to be refiners fire for each other. For those who imagined this evening, for everyone who's come, be present, we pray. Holy Spirit, we ask. Lead us into the knowledge of the truth, how that shapes who we are and why we are what we do with our lives. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Can we know the world and still love the world? I'm sure, my friends, that there's not a harder question in all of life than that question. Just think about it for a moment. You don't have to answer anything, say anything, but just think through of the hard questions you know. And know the world and still love the world. Can you know the world and still love the world? My wife and I were in Central Europe this past month for a week or so, and visiting the cities of Bratislava and Prague. I've been there many times over the years and met some remarkably visionary, courageous people there. If you have taken up the language of common good, common grace here, they have too, interestingly. But unlike you, I don't know all of you, of course, but I will get to know some of you this weekend. But these are people who've lived through generations of totalitarianism, which in some ways puts them in a different category, perhaps, than most of us in this room tonight. So if you were one of them, and I was talking to you tonight, I would assume that you too have suffered. It may be family sorrow, which all of us have some ways in our lives to deal with. But for these people, it's political, social, cultural, historical grief and wound and sorrow. And everyone I've talked to over the years, I've been there many times, has some story to tell. You think, and some tearful conversation to have. Some grief to be willing to share if you are willing to press it a little bit and ask carefully. Because it was the Nazis in the 30s and the 40s. Communism came in almost immediately afterwards in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, and finally late 89. Communism imploded in that part of the world. And it all of a sudden seemed like the wicked witch of the East was finally going to be dead. All things would become new. I've walked the streets of Prague several times in my life, thinking through again what Václav Havel had to say to the world and to the Czech people in those years. I stood looking at the balconies he spoke from. I read his books again and again. My wife and I had breakfast in his favorite cafe a few weeks ago, Cafe Slavia. I just wanted to sit again where he sat with his friends, thinking through what a new world ought to look like in that part of Europe. I take it pretty seriously. So in some ways, I've come back again and again these people because they know that I've listened carefully to them over time. About 3 years ago, I was asked to come back and speak for a weekend like this, with the people who are from all over that part of the world. They said, come back this time. It'll be the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, which was how they described the revolution in 1989, because there were no tanks, no machine guns. It was simply ideas that brought about the implosion of the Soviet Empire, the Velvet Revolution. Come back this time and speak about where we are 30 years later. What is the challenge of vocation for the common good 30 years later? Meg and I went together, and I spent a good weekend with them up in the Tatras, the beautiful mountains, that part of Europe. And I came back, and I just kept thinking about what I'd heard again, who they were again. We were there again this past month, and I offered you tonight 2 remarkably beautiful photos. I took them beautiful, but they were just beautiful things to capture just because they were there to be seen. Bratislava, Prague, the former Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, now Slovakia, they would be in the world. But Bratislava is the city that was right on the Danube. If you were taking that cruise along the way or biked along the way, and then you've been through Bratislava. It is, literally, a fairy tale kind of a city with cobblestone streets, a castle on the hill, and pastel-colored buildings in the ancient part of the city. You just think, God, heavens, this is a beautiful place to be, isn't it? But across the Danube, there are literally miles and miles and miles of architecturally embodied ugliness left by the communists. These giant buildings, not intended for human beings to live in. They just wanted to house people. When they left, of course, they left all this. There was no place else for people to live. So they're just there now. So something you have to put together in your mind both this sort of ancient beauty, glory of a medieval-looking city with all these things. You just think, oh, I could love to be here day after day of my life. And then across the river, thinking, oh my, that's such an ugly remnant of communism. More I could say about Bratislava. Prague we visited too, and we were just walking across the bridge one night, and all of a sudden it just seemed like the sun was just like that, the clouds were just like that, the sunset, and you don't get quite the colors don't quite translate for you here, but it's a beautiful castle, cathedral on a hill, in this ancient city, and you just think, my, isn't Prague a beautiful place to be? But my wife and I have also walked through the Jewish ghetto of Prague, which is just a few blocks on the side of the Charles Bridge in that city. It's a devastated place in the 1940s. The invitation was, this was called the Jewish Immigration Society, they call it. They walked around house by house and said, now you're going to be invited to become part of the Jewish Immigration Society. And we're taking you by train. At that point, of course, there was no Holocaust language. Nobody writing memoirs about inside the Third Reich. No Holocaust movies to watch, ponder, and think through. And we didn't know the story of what happened after the war at that point. Simply human beings, men, women, boys and girls, being drawn out of long-established homes and neighborhoods, getting on trains in Prague, not very far from where this photo is taken, actually, and taken initially to Terezín, it's called, an hour north of Prague. My wife and I walked through Terezín a few weeks ago. I just wanted to be there again, just to think through what happened here over time. The Nazis maintained it as a showplace for the International Red Cross. And they would bring the best artists in Europe back to show they were taking good care of the Jews after all. In reality, there was a train track running through Terezín, which we walked right by. It's not about actually quite a few hours. Which we would take what they called the transport, which was a train full of Jews to Auschwitz. And it's a sober place to be. We spent some hours there. I could have spent probably days there. I've lived within this story for a long time in my own life, quite deeply, actually. So somehow you have to deal with both Prague and the city of glory, but also shame. It is both at the same time. Just like Bratislava is, isn't it? Glory and ruin. And brothers and sisters, that's the reality of life in the world. We have to deal with that. There's no other story to tell than that story, actually. In fact, somehow we are both together all day long, all of us. Both glory and ruin. We'll talk about that tonight, tomorrow, and on Sunday, different kinds of ways. But I want you to think through with me why, how, and how that is both true. Why and how that is both true. Can we use those words about Princess Mary himself? Driving to the city this afternoon with Jessica, she said, well, they've actually taken the statue down now. Was that true? In the park? Because no longer is it possible to in Francis Marion Park to have the Francis Marion statue. Why? Well, is that right?
It was John C. Calhoun in Marion Square. So
Lots of complicated stories here, aren't there? And how do you somehow, as again, I'm not one of you, I'm not South Carolinian, but watched and listened and read, and I can't think of anybody who seems to me to be more of a statewide hero than Francis Marion. You have your own hotel here in town a few blocks away, and you're just kind of listening to the state and reading about who you are. I can't think of anybody who seems to have sort of generationally speaking, who has sort of hero status across South Carolina. Maybe you know, I'm sure you know more than I do. He's at least somebody who would compete for our great man, Francis Marion, as he was. My grandfather Garber was ironically, providentially named Francis Marion Garber. So I've always had this sort of unusual sense of identification with this swamp fox that he was. The third generation of Huguenot immigrants to America, coming from France to England, getting a land grant from the king, coming across on a boat. His grandfather has some acres allotted to him along the river, not so far from here. He does well, he works hard, his father gets into it, his father dies early, he's one of several children. His bigger brother was, a pretty good businessman, a farmer, and Francis, who's one of the youngest of the kids in the family, ends up living with his brother for a while, and he gets some land himself, and you probably know the story, but I never do that. But I was reading one of the biographies again this past week just to make sure that I knew enough about the story to speak honestly about it here tonight. But I've lived my life in some ways, given my grandfather's name in the light of the story, Swamp Fox. I took it to be a very important story, actually. And of all things that might be said about him, about what he did with his life and what he didn't do with his life, what always intrigues me is the question, why would somebody choose to get involved when they didn't have to? Why would somebody choose to step into the world, step into history, complicated as it was then, complicated as it is now? We can imagine, well, it would have been easier then, wouldn't it? We didn't have all those questions in there. Well, if you read the story of 1750s, 60s, 70s in America, it was a very complicated time, And right here in South Carolina, it would be wonderful to think about that. Politically, historically, economically, socially, lots of pushing and shoving as to who you were going to be in this part of this, English Commonwealth that you were at the time. Would you be this? Would you be that? And you said that. What would it be for me? And and who's going to fight on this side and on that side? And the question, of course, of Francis Marion was, he was deciding, in fact, that for all the complex political, historical, social reasons he did, in fact, he was going to push back against the redcoats. And it's the love of the story, isn't it? He learned things, becoming part of Indian, fights against the native populations of South Carolina early in his life. He learned about hitting and running and doing this and doing that and surprising somebody. And he brings, of course, those warfare techniques to bear upon fighting the redcoats in the swamps of the lowland of South Carolina. He became a hero, which we're still remembering in a certain way, 50 years later. So the swamp fox he was. I won't linger here other than to have you know that my grandfather was, in fact, Francis Marion Garber. It's a story I've lived with for most of my life. But he was a Huguenot, Francis Marion. My wife and I walked by the Huguenot Society of South Carolina building just a few blocks away this afternoon. It is right there, isn't it? So maybe you do, maybe you don't know the Huguenot story. These were French Protestants 700 years ago, who got pushed and pushed. It was a big massacre one day, and we still remember it, the terrible things that happened. The Huguenots decided to move here, and finally a whole bunch of them ended up in a little village called Les Chambon sur Lignon. It should be S-U-R, sorry. It's in the mountains of the southeastern part of France. A farming village, always been that. But in 1941, 42, Nazism began to find its way across Europe. It began to be known among the Jews that if you wanted to be safe and be kept alive during this terrible time as they couldn't know what it was going to actually mean for all of them. If you get to Leshem alone, you'd be cared for. And so about 5,000 Jews over those next several years found their way to the basements and barns of these Huguenot people in Leshem. It's a remarkable story. It's a fascinating story. One I've just been thinking about for a lot of my life now, actually. Because the question, of course, for them was this question. Why would you care when most of Europe didn't care? Why would you care? Most of Europe said, it is not me. That is mine to care. I have other things to do with my life, actually. There's a documentary filmmaker who did a film called Weapons of the Spirit some years ago. And he took his camera up with a little cog train up to the hillside of the mountains and gets off and walks through the village of Eshemon and says, so why did you care? Why did you help the Jews? And why did you help the Jews? To the people who are now 70s, 80s, and the 90s now. One by one, for the next 2 or 3 hours, he's just telling his story. I ask people to say, well, why did you care? And almost everyone says, it wasn't a big deal. What else could I have done? I don't want to talk about it. What else could I have done? Well, of course, most of you have said, I'm not interested. Almost overwhelmingly. And these Huguenot people said, in fact, we're responsible. For love's sake, we're responsible. It's a great, great, great story for us to think about, actually. But why did you care when most of Europe didn't care? Why did you care? Well, we all live in historical moments, don't we? Always political moments, too. They have to be. But threaded through, it's always a matter of character and conscience, of what we believe about what it means to be both holy and human. But again, at the heart of vocation is to see oneself as implicated for love's sake, in the way the world is, in the way the world could be, and someday will be. So my question tonight is, hey, you know the world is about you? I want us to do some theological thinking tonight together. And for me, I would want to begin, as I always want to begin with, what does the Hebrew vision of life in the world teach us? Anybody who really wants to know much about me, which is most people, of course, but somebody who really wants to say, what about you? How do you think? What do you believe in? I will always say something about, I think and live out of the Hebrew and Christian way of living and of thinking, way of seeing the world. I want to include Hebrew and Christian, hold them together, actually. So when I think about the question of why would you care, I'm drawn back to how the Hebrews understood this question, why would you care? There's a word in the Hebrew scriptures, from Genesis all the way through to the end of Malachi. It's the word yada. It's not Seinfeld's yada, yada, yada. It's a meaningless. But actually, it's a remarkably rich Hebrew word, yada. If you follow it through from Genesis all the way through the scriptures, it means again and again and again to have knowledge of, means to have responsibility to, means to have care for. So if you know, then you care. If you don't care, then you don't know. And you can see how far that is from us living in an info-glut culture. We hear so much about everything 24/7, as we say. We think, well, I know that, but so what? What's it mean for me? I know that, yeah, but so what anyway? In the Hebrew mind, if you knew, there had to be some consequence. In the Hebrew mind, there had to be some kind of meaning for what that you knew. Because if you knew, then you had to care. It was mediated by this idea of responsibility. Play it out a little bit with me here for a few minutes here. Isn't it fascinating to think about? The very first temptation we have in the history of the whole universe is a question about what do you do with what you know, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We don't have to use this language, but I think it's helpful if you really want to ponder it. I've come to think of that tree as an epistemological temptation with a moral heart. It's a question of what you know, but then what are you going to do with what you know? And that's the very first question we have in this week. The first temptation we have is the primordial temptation. What are you going to do with what you know? A few chapters later, we have that remarkably intimate, poignant, personal, mysterious language that Adam knew Eve, his wife. Sexual connotation, sexual meaning written into the whole idea of it all. But you see, it is not knowing in the abstract. Yes, I know that, but it's in fact saying something about that I'm drawn into the most profound way of who I am as a human being, to knowing and therefore caring. It's the same Hebrew word used in Exodus chapter 1, where we have the writer saying, there came to be a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. This is the sexual meaning. Of course, Adam knew his wife, but you see, it's the same idea that he knew, but he didn't care. Yes, I know it, as I don't know about Joseph, but that story is no longer a story that shapes who we are 40 years later. And just follow that idea through, that one word through, from Genesis, Exodus, all the way through the scriptures. You find words like in Proverbs, a righteous man cares about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. It's the same Hebrew word, yadad. Hundreds of times the word is used. If you're interested in playing this out more fully, there's a chapter in the Visions of Vocation where I dug into that more thoroughly and just walked through much more carefully. But this idea has really captured me for a lot of the years of my life. Wrestling with, how do you know the world and still care about it? Because I would say that to me is really the hardest of all the questions. And I think it was from the very beginning of time. Clearly, Father Adam and Mother Eve stumbled over that. We might think that House of Cards tells the story first and last of cynicism. American politics, look at that actually. Washington, D.C., isn't that terrible? It was a BBC show first, of course, House of Cards, we wrote King of America. BBC, British politics. Cynicism goes back thousands of years, even thousands of years before Christ was born. People call themselves officially, they name themselves, we are the cynics. Why is that? Because cynicism is born of that primordial temptation. The temptation being, what do you do with what you know? And as sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, what do? We say, no. I'm not going to connect that with this. Because in fact, I know that if I don't actually stab you in the back, you're going to stab me in the back. That's just how it is. That's who you are. That's what it says to live in the world. That's how people are, actually. If there's cynicism on that side, on the underside of cynicism is what has been for thousands of years called Stoicism. And Stoicism is the underbelly of cynicism. I would argue. It's also about what are you going to do with what you know? And Stoicism says, what instead? Not if I don't stab you, you'll stab me. It says, I'm no longer 20. I'm no longer young and idealistic. I no longer think like that. Come on, I've grown up actually. The world isn't really like that. It can't be like that. And it won't be like that. So I don't believe that kind of stuff anymore at all. I won't be drawn in like that anymore in my life. I'm going to turn the barometer of my heart down actually. But I won't be tricked or pretended to. I won't be lied to anymore. Because the world isn't like that. Because I know in fact the world is different than that. I won't care like that, like I used to care. And you can see that as human beings, we wrestle through probably all day long, all of us, with the temptations of cynicism and stoicism. Why? Because it goes so profoundly out of that primordial temptation. What are you going to do with what you know? Jesus, of course, who comes to us as fully God, fully human, but also fully Hebrew. He assumes this world and worldview in his own body, his thinking, his teaching. So the Gospels are full of the assumption of this Hebrew epistemology, this covenantal epistemology, as we might call it. We could talk a lot more about that. Maybe just to say, before we take a little moment to talk together, but the very last words of the Sermon on the Mount are what? After blessed are, 3 chapters later, the very last words we have recorded by the Gospel of Matthew are, there'll be 2 responses to what I've said to you today. And the responses are these. It's maybe a little Sunday school ditty for some of us, but actually it's quite profound teaching to think through in your life and mine. 2 responses are what? Some of you have heard what I've said and you won't put it into practice. And you'll be like those who build a house on the sand. The rains come down, the winds begin to blow, and your houses will just wash away. Others of you will have heard what I've said today, and you'll put it into practice. And you'll be like those who, when you build a house, you build on the rock. When the rains come, the winds blow, your house will stand. Why? Because in fact, you've put what I've said into practice. And you can see it in the very teaching of Jesus explicitly. The first words we have recorded of him in the Gospels. He makes this Hebrew epistemology, this Hebrew way of knowing, the sum, in fact, to make sense of all that I've said, here are these words then. Not this, it must be this. You've got to put it into practice. You can't just know in the abstract, you've got to actually do. Knowing and doing have to be somehow held together. There's a responsibility for knowledge in the Hebrew Christian way of making sense of your life and mine. Well, let's talk a little bit together. Take a break, get up, go to the bathroom, have another drink of something, get another piece of little good South Carolina ham or something, and some cheese. And if we want to talk a little bit, do that, we'll come back and we'll dig in a little bit more fully before we end.